born in Chicago, Illinois. Then he grew up in the northwest of Ohio, but we'll forgive him. He graduated from the University of Toledo with a degree in journalism, English, and psychology. And he spent 5 years doing research on Ireland and the Irish people as inspiration for his series Irish Crossings. And that research inspired this talk today. So please welcome Terence O'Leary.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
So far.
That's the most important.
Yeah, so far.
Okay, I do need to make one small correction from Stephen's talk. For the last year, I've been living down in Temperance, Michigan. So I am a Michigan native, but I do definitely live in Michigan. Oh my goodness, got a good crowd here. What am I doing here? What am I doing in Milford, Michigan's public library, standing in front of you good people tonight, to talk about all things the Irish Potato Famine, something that happened over 175 years ago. Well, I'm an Irish-American author and speaker. I've been writing for about 25 years now. And I started out writing a trilogy of sports novels, young adult novels about teenagers facing a family crisis. And I covered the three big themes: soccer, baseball, and football. And I was very pleased with the trilogy. It was something that I always wanted to do. But when I finished the last book, I said, what am I going to do now? Because I love to write. There's nothing I would rather do than just spend the morning writing on my computer. So we were sitting around, it was Christmas time with my family, we were sitting around and talking about our ancestors. And I know a lot of you here today, you're interested in your genealogy, your ancestors. And I remembered that this book that my Gigi, my grandmother, Irma Cannon, gave me when I was a much younger man. And this book on Grandpa's knee was compiled by two of my cousins, Sister Mary Angela Finney and Patrick Colton. And in here is the history of all the Finneys. Now, the Finneys are on my mom's side of the family. This is the history of all the Finneys, going all the way back to the first Finneys who came to America. And I started reading this book. Patrick and Catherine Finney, they had 7 children, and right in the middle of the potato famine, they were evicted from their farm. And they had to leave. And luckily, they had enough money saved that they could get on a famine ship. And we're going to talk a lot about the famine ships tonight. Now, the oldest girl, Bridget, was engaged to be married. And she said, I'm not leaving. I'm not going. I'm staying here and getting married. So she stayed behind. And at the last moment, one of the younger brothers, Michael, said, she can't stay all by herself. So he stayed with her. So Patrick and Catherine took the remaining 5 children, and they took them on one of the famine ships. Patrick and Catherine died on the ship, like so many of the Irish back in those days. The 5 children were stranded in New York City. The youngest girl, who was only 5 years old, and she was adopted by the Quakers. 2 of the boys stayed in New York, but 2 of the boys were more adventurous. And they did what so many of the Irish did back in those days. They started working their way across the country. Now, it took them 10 years. And they were basically just laborers. They worked on the railroads. They dug the canals. They helped to build the bridges. And they kept going further and further west because they heard about this almost magical place in America called Garryowen, which is in Iowa, and it's just southwest of Dubuque on the Mississippi River. And it took them 10 years, but they finally made it to Garryowen. And it was the paradise they were looking for. The land there reminded them so much of the Ireland they left behind. So they took their small savings that they had saved over 10 years and bought a small farm. And they also helped to build St. Patrick's Church, which still stands today. It's a historical monument in Garryowen. And one of those two brothers was Thomas Finney, my grandfather's grandfather. And when I finished that story, I said, Terry, if ever there is a book that needs to be written, that's the story you need to tell. Little did I know that I would spend the next 6 years of my life doing research, taking trips over to Ireland, and that I wouldn't write just one book, but 3 books. But I was like so many of the Irish Americans, especially those here today. You have a hunger to know about the famine, but you really don't know what it was like. You don't know what it was like. At a time, the famine went on for 5 years, and 1 million people died, and 1 million people immigrated. And the injustice that the Irish suffered, we're going to talk about that today. So finally, after doing all of this research and reading as many books as I can, and traveling to Ireland to feel what the earth feels like in my fingers, and to stand underneath the stars, I finally feel that I can now stand in front of you and talk about the Potato Famine. And that's what we're going to do. So sit back, we're going to be here probably for 45 minutes, and we're going to tell about the Irish Potato Famine. But to do this, you're going to have to go back in time with me. You're going to have to see what it was like, what the Irish, the living conditions the Irish were under. And to start the talk, we're going to have to go back even further than that. We're going to have to go back to the 12th century, the 1170s. And that is when Henry II came over to Ireland from England and conquered Ireland. And for the next 700 years, England ruled Ireland with an iron fist. Now, if you know anything about the Irish, they're a rebellious lot. They want their freedom. They want their land. They want their own say in the government. And the history of the next 700 years in Ireland is a history of rebellion, rebellion, and rebellion. The first major rebellion happened in the 1640s. And that's Oliver Cromwell came from England to suppress the rebellion. Now, if you go to Ireland today and you mention Oliver Cromwell, people still spit on the street. That one man did more to destroy Ireland than any other man in history. When he came over with his soldiers, Ireland lost 1/3 of their population. They either died in battle, or they died from disease, or they were made into what the Irish call white slaves, and what the English call indentured servants. And they shipped the Irish out of Ireland to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and to the cotton plantations in the United States. And what else did Oliver Cromwell do? He took the land away from the Irish. So all the lands that the Finneys and the O'Learys and the O'Briens, all the land that they owned for generation upon generation, Cromwell took that and gave it to his cronies, and the Irish now became tenant farmers on their own land. So of course the Irish are going to keep revolting. Now we'll go up to the 1690s. This is, I'm sure you've heard about the Battle of the Boyne. The Irish bet King James II against King William of Orange, and once again the Irish lost. So what's going to happen to the Irish now? They've already lost all their land. So what happened now is they enacted the penal laws. They took the right away from an Irish man to practice his religion. They took away the right for an Irishman to have an education and to have any say in his government. And that was the penal laws that came out of the 1690 Code. Ireland revolted again, 1798. Now this time they had some help from the French. This was in the time of Napoleon. But once again, the Irish lost. And the result of that was the Act of the Union, where Ireland basically dissolved and was incorporated into England. there wasn't any local, you couldn't go anywhere in Ireland to complain to anyone. You couldn't go to Dublin, because now all the government was coming out of Parliament in England. That's what it was like when we were coming up to 1845, the first year of the famine. Now, Ireland at the beginning of the famine was the most populous country in Europe. Ireland had a population of 8.5 million people. You get the picture. Ireland's about the size of the state of Indiana. And there are 8.5 million people in this small country. Now, if you go back in history, less than 100 years earlier, there were only 2.5 million people in Ireland. How did this country, this small country, increase their population by 6 million people in less than 100 years? Well, first of all, the Irish married when they were very young. The typical Irish married back in those days, the boy was 16 and the girl was 15. So they had a head start on most other people. And the other thing is, my daughter Brittany tells me all the time, she can just walk by her husband and she gets pregnant. The Irish are a very fertile race. I come from a small Irish family. I have 5 sisters. Back in the day of the family, it was very common to have 12 to 15 kids in the family. There is incidents of one family with 25 children. I mean, that poor mother, give me a break. But it doesn't take long when you have that many children for the population to go up and up and up. But this created a tremendous problem for Ireland, because there's only so much land. There's only so much land where you can plant crops. And what had happened is, as each generation came along, the crops, the land became, acreage became smaller and smaller and smaller. Until in 1845, the average farm, 25% of them were less than 5 acres. You can't live on a farm that small. Another 15% were less than 10 acres. So how do they live? I mean, and plus, since they were tenant farmers, most of the crops that they grew, they had to use to pay the rent. So let's take a typical Irish tenant farmer. He has 5 acres. What he does is he'll plant 4 acres of the grain crops, of corn, wheat, barley, and take those grain crops, harvest them, and use that to pay the rent. So that leaves him this 1 acre for himself. But this miracle crop came to Ireland. The potato. The potatoes came over in 1590, and the potatoes thrived on especially the rocky soil of Western Ireland. And if you plant 1 acre of potatoes, those potatoes will yield 12 tons of potatoes. And you could feed your family for almost the entire year on just 1 acre. It was a miracle crop. Now, it's hard for us to picture this, because we like our potatoes, but not like the Irish. The Irish ate potatoes every day, 365 days a year. And what they would do, they would eat the potatoes every day of their life. And the average male in Ireland ate between 12 and 14 pounds of potatoes a day. Picture this, seriously, 60 to 70 potatoes a day, every day. How could you do that? I mean, I tried. But that's what the Irish lived on. They lived on potatoes. But they did all these scientific surveys, and they found out that you can survive just on potatoes. And back then, if you had access to buttermilk, which most of the small villages had a cow, and you could get buttermilk, and most of the Irish families would raise a piglet and grow it, stay right there with the family in the same cottage. And of course, they fed the piglet until the piglet was big enough to be a pig to feed them, but they would have some access to bacon. But if you have buttermilk and a little bacon and a potato diet, you can survive. And they found out at that time in Ireland, the men were taller and stronger than their European counterpart, who existed on a grain diet. And of course, we also know the Irish were better looking. That's the other advantage, the potatoes. But, and there's a lot of buts in this story. But what happens when you rely just on one crop? I mean, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and that's what the Irish were doing. And there were times in the past history of Ireland where the potatoes failed. The last major failure was between 1792 and 93. And what England did at that time is they closed all the ports in Ireland. So anything that was grown in Ireland stayed in Ireland. And the Irish didn't starve. But now we're under a different government in England. So now you're relying just on potatoes. The famine started in 1845. And luckily for the Irish, it only affected about 1/4 of the crop. And no one starved in 1845. So the Irish did what they still do today. They crossed their fingers, they said a prayer, they went out and planted the new potatoes for the coming year, and they hoped for a healthy crop. They say it was just like a dark fog that crept all over Ireland. And the farmers woke up in the morning to this most unbearable stench in the air. And they raced out their door, and they heard all these screams coming from their neighbors. And they went out to their potato patch. And in the potatoes, the stalks were wilted. They went down, picked up the potatoes themselves. And they picked up the potato, put it in their hand, and if they closed their hand, the potato pushed out between their fingers. The potatoes all turned black, and there was no way that they could eat them. Now, back in those days, no one had any idea what this was. We know today now it was Phytophthora infestans, which is the best way to describe it is like a fungus that's just airborne and waterborne and just swept all over Ireland. And the thing was, the potatoes infected not only the potatoes that were growing, but the potatoes that they had stored in the pit in the ground to live on. The potatoes they had stored in the loft of their cabins to live on. They were all black. They were inedible. We don't understand how drastic this was for the Irish. Because if I go home and I don't have potatoes, I just pull something else off the shelf. There was nothing else for the Irish to pull off the shelf, because all they had were potatoes. And the other tragedy of this time period in Ireland is the Irish had no money. They lived on a barter system. Out in the west coast of Ireland, they didn't even know what money was. The barter system, if someone had a couple eggs and you had a little bacon, you just switch. Because they had no money. And during the 5 years of the Potato Famine, there was plenty of food in Ireland. But the Irish didn't have money to buy the food. So they were starting to starve. It doesn't take long. If you don't have any food, then you have no money to starve. And this began the days when 1 million Irish died and 1 million Irish emigrated. But word started getting out. A lot of it was the Catholic priests writing to their contemporaries in Europe and the United States, saying, you've got to do something. You've got to help us. Our people are starving and dying. And finally, world opinion turned against England, because you have to remember, England ruled Ireland. Irish were the subjects of England. And it was English responsibility to take care of her subjects. And she wasn't doing that. So, finally, the English realized they had to do something. So their answer, figure this is their answer. They came up with a public works proclamation. They were not going to give the Irish charity. If the Irish wanted money to buy food, they were going to work for it. And they put the Irish to work building roads. And if you go to Ireland today, you will still see what they call famine roads. These roads go from one place to another place, but they go nowhere. It was busy work. Picture this. The husband gets up before dawn. He has to walk a couple miles to the workplace. He spends all day breaking bricks to turn into pebbles to put down for the roads. And at the end of the day, they don't pay him. What they do is they send him home and say, come back tomorrow, and maybe if you come back every day, we'll pay you a little bit at the end of the week. These are Irish who are starving. The Irish were dropping dead on the side of the road. There were over 700,000 Irish working on these roads that went nowhere, and they were dying. And finally, the English had to realize that this was a dismal failure. It wasn't working. But now help starts coming in. And the donations start coming in from America and from Europe. But the biggest help and the most surprising help for me came from the Quakers. And what the Quakers did is they came to Ireland and they brought 300 large soup cauldrons. And they made soup. And they fed the Irish soup. And you're not going to get fat on soup, but you can stay alive. And they shamed the English into opening soup kitchens throughout Ireland. And in the summer of 1847, the English were feeding 3 million Irishmen a day in the soup kitchens. So you think, well, that's it. Story's over. England turned out to be the good guys after all. But a new regime came in place. And remember we talked about Oliver Cromwell? Now we have another name to put right up next to him, Charles Trevelyan. Charles Trevelyan was in charge of the Treasury for Great Britain. And he came out with this proclamation in 1847 that from now on, Irish property will pay for Irish poverty. What does that mean? Irish property will pay for Irish poverty. In essence, he would now tax every landlord, every merchant, every farmer, anyone in Ireland would have to pay taxes. And those taxes would go to the workhouse, and in the workhouse, the Irish would go there to get soup. Now, let's think about this. So you're feeding 3 million Irish a day. Now, here comes another irony. Because when the new potato crop came in 1847, it was the only year, the 5 years of the famine, where the potatoes were healthy. How did that happen? We don't know. But you go back to the winter of 1846, when the Irish mother was starving and she had these 12, 15 kids in her cabin, and they had nothing at all to eat. So she committed what to her was a mortal sin. She knew she shouldn't do it, but she had no choice. So she fed her children the seed potatoes. Now, it took me a while to figure out what this is, because my wife was a master gardener. And she goes out to the garden and plants seeds and everything starts popping up. That isn't the way potatoes work. You know, if you pick up a potato and you see the white eyes, those are the seeds. So to plant potatoes, you have to keep a certain portion of your crop every year. And those are the seed potatoes you put back in the ground to plant and harvest your next year's potatoes. But the Irish ate their seed potatoes. So even though it was a blight-free crop, it was only enough, it was only 25% of what was needed to feed the Irish. And it wasn't long before the Irish started to starve again. So, what are you going to do? It's 1847. You have three choices. Your first choice, and regrettably it happened to a lot of the Irish, is they just gave up. They just were too beaten down. They just couldn't handle it anymore. Your second choice, to get that soup now, you know you have to get in the workhouse. Well, remember how England was feeding 3 million Irish a day? There were 130 workhouses scattered across Ireland. You know, go back to your readings of Dickens. The workhouse is nothing more than a jail. You know, you go in there, the name says workhouse, you're going to work. You're going to darn socks, you're going to grate bricks, you're going to grain corn, but you're going to work. These were 130 workhouses, and they were designed to handle 115,000 people. 3 million people are now starving again. To get soup, you have to go in the workhouse, but they can only take 115,000 people. What's going to happen? So now, Skibbereen, which was like the epicenter. Anything bad that happened during the potato famine happened in Skibbereen. Skibbereen's workhouse was designed to handle 815 people. During the famine, there were 3,784 people outside the workhouse trying to get in. And they were starving, and they couldn't get in. And next to Skibbereen, Aberystwyth, there's a mass graveyard, a big pit in the ground, where it is estimated that 8,000 to 10,000 Irish were tossed into that pit during the time of the potato famine. So think, what are your chances? What are your chances of getting into the workhouse? And plus, the workhouse gave preferential treatment to children. So if you're an adult, pretty much forget it. So now this story has so many different threads, and I need to pull them all together for you. Because we have to talk about the Irish evictions, because that was a big, big part of what was happening during the potato famine. Now, Irish were being evicted from their farms before the potato famine even started. And what had happened? We've got to look at the world view. I mean, this is the 1840s. England is the strongest, richest, mightiest power in the world. And they're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So in England, the farmers are coming off the farms and going into the cities. And what they're doing in the cities is they're taking the manufacturing jobs and they're making money. And they have money in their pockets. And what they want with this money is they want beef on the table. They want meat. Now, England has always looked at Ireland as being their breadbasket. They would go to Ireland to get their grain. But now there's this upstart country across the pond called America. And they can now get corn and wheat and rye cheaper from America than they could from Ireland. What they wanted from Ireland is they wanted beef. And if you go to Ireland today, it's mainly the biggest industry is dairy farms. There's cows. And to put it in perspective, what the English landlords wanted to do They wanted the Irish to be gone off their farm. And they wanted to turn that farmland into pastures to raise cows. Because they could take the cows and be in England that same day. And they knew there was money in the cows. And you know what? On my last trip to Ireland, today in Ireland, there are 6.9 million people between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, 6.9 million people. There are 7.4 million cows in Ireland. So the landlords got the wish. There are now more cows in Ireland than there are people. Now, English landlords, they want the Irish gone to turn into dairy. And the incentive came from Trevelyan, Charles Trevelyan, because he's taxing those landlords for every one of their tenants. And that was all the landlords needed. They just started evicting their tenants left and right. They evicted 700,000 Irish during that time frame. And that's just the ones we know about. Because what was happening back then is the sheriff would go and put the notice to quit on your cabin door. And that meant you had to leave your cabin, or the next day they'd come back and arrest the husband because they owed the rent on the land. And without the husband, how was the family going to survive? So if the notice to quit appeared on the door, a lot of the families would just get up and leave in the dark of the night and become the wanderers, just a mass of Irish that are just roving the countryside searching for food. So, your second choice is to get in the workhouse. What are your chances? 3 million trying to get in, 115 able to get in. Now, we also have to talk about death in Ireland. Because I keep talking about the starving Irish, and a lot of the Irish did starve during the Potato Famine. But the vast majority of them didn't starve to death. They died of disease. And if you go back and study history, anytime you have a famine, disease accompanies the famine. You become weak, you're malnourished, you can't take care of yourself, you're susceptible to disease. And the two big diseases the Irish feared more than anything else. Top of the list, black fever. That's what we call typhus today. It affects the blood flow in your body. It causes the blood vessels to swell till they burst. And when they burst, your skin takes on this black hue. And that's why they call it black fever. You have running temperature, you get gangrene, gangrenous sores all over your body, unbearable headaches. It's a terrible, terrible way to die. And it's almost always fatal. And that was the Irish man's biggest worry, is that he would contact this black fever. And they had no idea what it was causing it, and they had no idea how to cure it, or even how to treat it. The second one they were worried about was yellow fever. And that was relapsing fever. That was like the worst stomach flu you've ever had. And your body fights it and fights it and fights it, and finally you start getting better, and bam, it comes back again. You fight it, and bam, it comes back again. You keep relapsing until you finally either win or you succumb to it. But out of those two fevers, the one thing they had in common, and the Irish did not know, both the black fever and the yellow fever were transmitted by body lice. So anytime the Irish would gather together in a room like this, those body lice would just transfer from one person's clothes to another. And they would look for that little open spot on your skin, and they would bite you, and voila! You have typhus or relapsing fever. The Irish didn't know that. So when the Irish gathered in the workhouse, gathered in the soup kitchen, the typhus would come. If you could get into the workhouse, back at that time, 20 to 30% of you are going to die within 3 months, probably of disease. So there was no guarantee. So, what's your third choice? Give up, try to get in the workhouse, or door number 3, you get out of Ireland. And the Irish would do whatever they could to get out of Ireland. And that's going to bring us to the next part of the talk here. Let's talk about the famine ships. Now, you got to remember, this is the 1845 to 1850. Now, there were steamships in those days, but there's no way an Irishman, a tenant farmer, could afford a steamship. So the type of ship he would be looking at would be a sailing ship. Now, how did they pay for their passage? They would sell whatever they had. Whatever they had that was valuable, they would pawn anything else. They would do whatever they could. At the beginning of the famine, a lot of the Irish were trying to get their older sons to get over to America to get a job to send money back. And there was a lot of the Irish who were brought over during the famine, came over from donations from their relatives who were already in America. So that was their connection. Now these ships, back in those days, these ships that the Irish were on, the famine ships, they were never designed to carry people. They were cargo ships. If they came from America, down in the hold of the ship, they carried grain, the corn and the wheat and the rye. If they came from Canada, down in the hold of the ship, they carried lumber. England had already depleted their force. They needed lumber to keep building the British Navy. So that was down here in the ship. Now these shipmasters, these captains, dropped off their cargo in England and Ireland, and they looked at the dock and wharf, and they go, my goodness, these Irish are crazy. They'll pay anything to get out of Ireland. And there's money to be made here. So captain would send his carpenter down into the hold of the ship. And what they would do is, now remember, this is just an open area, no windows, no lights. They would, on that side of the room of the hull, they'd build these 2 long platforms. And on the other side, they do the same. And those platforms, just a platform going the length of the hull, is where the Irish would sleep. You don't have your own cabin. You don't have your own bed. Hopefully families would be able to stay together, and they would stay together on this small section of the platform. And that's where they would sleep. Now, a lot of limitations. No open windows, no ventilation. The only light and air you get is from the cargo holds where they bring the grain down. You have no hygiene facilities. You're not going to take a shower. You're not going to take a bath. There are no toilets. There are buckets behind the sheet. I hope that you brought some extra food with you, because the captain's only going to give you the bare minimum. And then I mentioned something else. Take a look around. You might want to just look at your neighbors, say hi, and smile at them. Because you know what?
Hey.
And this is about the size. This would be a good small family ship. We're all going to be together in this ship, in this hold, this dark, dreary, wet hold, for the minimum of the next 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And that's if you're having a good crossing. Now, coming from America, you got the westerlies that blow you right across the ocean to Ireland. But coming back, you're fighting the wind the whole way. And if you hit a storm and you get blown off course, that 6 weeks can turn into months. And how much food do you have? How much fresh water do you have? But the minimum we're going to be together will be 6 weeks. And picture this. You know, if it was summertime, they'd open up the hatches, and if it was a nice captain, he might let you up on deck during the day. But we're trying to cross now in the fall and the winter. You never try to get across the Atlantic in the winter. You never want to fight those gales. But that's what the captains of the Irish were doing. So now we're down in the hold of the ship. The only light you have is a whale oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. That's the only light that you have down there. And it's cold, and it's dark, and it's damp. And did I talk about the rats? You know, if it carried grain, you're going to have rats. The rats are down there in the hold of the ship. And all of a sudden, it's wintertime, you hit a storm, you hit one of those gales. And the first thing the captain has to do is we have to extinguish that lamp. Because you can't have an open flame on a ship in a storm. Because if that lamp falls, whoop, you're all gone. The second thing he's going to do is batten down the hatches. So that hatch where you were getting whatever light and ventilation is now closed. And you're down there, huddled in your bed, the platform bed over your sides. And that storm hits, and you're tossed like a cork in the water. And that storm hits, and those waves rise up. Boom, the bottom drops out. People were tossed out of their bunks, hit the ground, break their arms, break their legs. And it's dark, and the storm goes on. Picture the worst roller coaster you've ever been on in your life. But you know the roller coaster is gonna end. They have no, these storms can go on for hours, they can go on for days. They can go on for weeks. And the Irish down there in the middle of that storm, they're screaming, they're praying for the Lord. Children are crying, people are getting sick all over you. People would go stark, raving mad. And that was life on a family ship back then. But as bad as that was, that isn't what gave the Irish titles. No. They could figure they could deal with that. What they couldn't handle is, unbeknownst to them, one of our latecomers walking into this room was scratching at her collar. And why was she scratching at her collar? Because she's carrying body lice. And we're down here, the hold of the ship. No place to run, no place to hide. And people started getting sick. No doctors, no medicine, no fresh water. And the disease would spread from one person to the next. The sick would lie next to the dying. And the dying would lie next to the dead. And the sharks would follow the famine ships across the ocean as they tossed the bodies of the Irish into the deep. 20 to 30% of the Irish who went on a famine ship never made it to America. So many Irish died that they started calling the famine ship coffin ships. But look around. We're here. Somehow, some way, especially if you're Irish in this room today, we made it. Maybe your ancestors came before the famine. Maybe they were on a good ship, one that did not have typhus. Maybe they came after the famine as part of the Irish chain. The Irish chain was those who went to America sent money back to Ireland so their relatives could join them. And that went on for generations. So now, our ancestors, they're in America. What's awaiting them? The end of the rainbow they were promised. The land of milk and honey. The Irish get off the ship. 75% of the Irish came into the port of New York. They get off the ship. What do they have? They had no money. Whatever money they had, they used to pay for their passage. They have no skills. They're not doctors or lawyers or bricklayers, butchers or bakers. They're dirt farmers. And worse than that is they have no education. 60% of the Irish who came to America during this time frame could not read and write their own name. That's why there's so many variations on the Irish names. Because they'd say it to the clerk and he'd say, spell it. Couldn't spell it. So he'd write down whatever he wanted. But they had no education. And regrettably, most of the Irish, well, a good percentage of the Irish who came during the famine, 5 points. The worst slum in the world, in New York City. That was the end of the rainbow. Wow. So what? Why did they do this? Why did they leave Ireland? If they stayed behind in Ireland, 20 to 30% of them are going to die. If you go to America on that voyage, 20 to 30% of you are going to die. So what's the difference? Why are they going through all this? The difference was because now they are in America. And you have no idea what that meant to an Irishman. Because America gave the Irish 3 blessings they didn't have in Ireland. Back in Ireland, during the famine and the years after the famine, there were no jobs. No matter how hard an Irishman wanted to work, there were no jobs for him. He didn't have the skills. He was just a dirt. In America, there were jobs. This was the big westward expansion. There were plenty of jobs in America. But for the Irish, there were jobs that no one else wanted to take. They were digging the foundations for the skyscrapers, digging the subways, digging the canals. But the Irish did not mind getting their hands dirty. An Irishman did not mind working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, as long as he knew that he would have enough money to buy food for his family so that they could live. And the more adventurous of the Irish, like my grandfather's grandfather, they left New York, they started heading west. They continued the westward expansion that brought us here to Michigan and out to Iowa. And like that, so many of the Irish who came during the time, they saved their money. When they had enough money, they bought their own farm. Just like my grandfather's grandfather. Do you have any idea what that meant for an Irishman? To get up in the morning, to open up his front door, and to walk out in his fields, and that is his land. For 700 years, an Irishman could not own his own land. Now in America, they could. That was the blessing that America gave the Irish. The second blessing, the Irish were clannish. They still are today. Not as bad as it was in the past. But they all had their enclaves. They all stayed together. And when they came over, like I mentioned, 75% of them came over to New York City. But in the 1850 census, 25% of the population of the major ports on the East Coast, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, they were all Irish. 25 in the census, 25% of the population of New York in 1850 were born in Ireland. And what they found here in America is they're playing by a different set of rules over here. You can have a voice in your government. You can make a difference. And that is what the Irish started doing. They started voting. And with that vote came power. Because now they can get the patronage jobs. They can become the policemen and the firemen and the building inspectors. They can start climbing that social ladder. Blessing, the one that's closest to my heart. If you go back and study the history of Ireland, you go back to the time of King Brian Boru, you go back to the time of St. Patrick, who came over here. And they created 800 monasteries that were all schools of learning. Ireland, when Europe was in the Dark Ages. Ireland was the light of the world. They were preserving the book. That is what the Irish were doing. They always had a love for education and knowledge. But when Cromwell came over, he destroyed all the monasteries. Now here, and we had a right to an education. And you cannot talk about the growth of the Irish in America unless you talk about the Catholic Church, because they were so instrumental in helping to educate the Irish back in that time period. And that was the greatest blessing that America gave to the Irish, is this education. So now with this education, the Irish now can become the lawyers and the doctors and the judges. Look at everything the Irish have accomplished since they've been here. You know, one of the talks that I used to call this talk, the Potato Famine, a terrible blessing for the Irish. Because it was a terrible blessing for the Irish. Because the Irish who survived and came to America, they far exceeded their expectations. They far advanced. They couldn't make those advancements at that time in Ireland, but they could in America. And look at how they prospered. Look in the population. This Irish chain of the Irish coming to America. Go back, 8.5 million people in Ireland at the beginning of the famine. When Ireland achieved their independence in 1921, the population in Ireland was less than 4 million people. Picture a country losing half their population. And where did they come? So many of them came to America. Last census report, there are 32 million people, Americans, say they have Irish heritage. And they do. And look at everything we've accomplished. So now, what I needed to do is, because I'm a writer, I mean, I had read so many books, historical books, that laid the groundwork for me. But I didn't want to just write another history. I didn't want to write a book with facts and figures. I wanted you to feel what the Irish were going through. So, I started out just writing one book, Caitlin and Patty's story. Caitlin and Patty, they're young lovers. They're only 15 and 16. They married basically when they're just still kids. You travel with them across Ireland, you see Ireland through their eyes. At a time when 1 million Irish died and 1 million Irish emigrated, you go with them on a famine ship. You think the talk was right way cheap on the ship. They make it to America, end up in 5 points. But you see the tenacity, the will to survive of the Irish. The whole time I'm writing Caitlin and Patty's story, I keep thinking about the family they left behind. Patty had 2 younger brothers. Danny was the middle brother. Danny stayed behind in Ireland for all 5 years of the family. In Danny's story, you see how the Irish were forced to build these roads that go nowhere. You see them being evicted from their small farms. You see them having their cottage tumbled in front of their eyes and trying to console their mother who has lost everything. You see them trying to get in the workhouse and knowing that even if they do, 20 or 30% of them are going to die. But you see the will to survive of the Irish. And the third brother, the little brother, the boy of the family, the baby, Michael's story. Michael had his own adventures across the Atlantic Ocean. And in America, he is united with Caitlin and Patty. And they begin the great westward migration of the Irish. That's how we ended up here in Michigan and Ohio and Indiana. Mainly they followed the railroads back in those days. So many of the Irish worked on the railroads. They kept going west because they wanted to find that magical place of Carrion. They kept following that dream. And then Danny, I can't give away the end of the story. Why would that be wrong? My goodness, what's the matter with me? Everything in the books is historically accurate. Just like this talk, you're going to shake your head and go, "No, that couldn't happen, that couldn't happen." But it did. And it did. And we must remember that. The famine changed the destiny of Ireland, but it also changed the destiny of America. And all I ask about my books is I've become an advocate. I go all across the Midwest giving this talk about the potato famine. This story is so important to our Irish heritage, and we need to keep it alive. So if you read the books, enjoy the books, but pass them on to somebody else, especially the younger generation. When I talk to high schools, these kids, they have no idea. They have no idea what our ancestors went. The Irish potato famine is becoming a footnote in history, and we need to keep it alive. So I do have the books off for sale up here. Take checks, cash, credit, your firstborn son, whatever works out for him.
Potato?
Yeah, potato, a bushel of potatoes in one book. And I do autograph them for you. And I also want to thank you for coming tonight. And I want to thank Stephen again and the Milford Public Library for hosting this so we could all get together. But again, thank you so much for listening.